Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And Alex, you just returned from one of the coolest places in the world, in my humble opinion, Lembeh Strait. You were there for a
Yeah.
couple weeks leading a workshop. So this episode is just kind of a catch up to hear about your trip, and maybe one or two other little things here and there. But the big
You
thing is
seem to be the
Lembeh.
one with the suntan, though. I'm like, don't seem to have any sun on the video recording.
uh,
But I think I do. I think
yeah,
it's just the. Yeah, I
no,
think just the.
I'm bronzed. I'm
Yeah.
bronzed.
Well, I guess
Um,
you do live in Florida, so. Mm.
but anyway, so how was Lembe?
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. It's always been one of my favourite places to visit, and I would say if I was actually pushed to choose you can only go, to this one place, I'd probably plump for Lembeh because I love that style of diving. It really, the searching really pushes my buttons. I'm really into seeing all that weird and wonderful marine life, which I think is also really good. It's ridiculously photographically productive. I shot just under 10,000 images. And before you say that's completely crazy, um, our friend Nick Moore was on the trip as well, and he shot 10,000 pictures as well. So, it's not like it wasn't just me being crazy on the shutter. And what I love about Lembeh is, you do a lot of diving every day, and for most minutes of most dives, you're in front of quality subjects. So you just shoot a lot on every dive because you see a lot. It's not that you're taking ridiculous numbers of shots of particular creatures. It's just there's always something great to shoot. And particularly for me, I like to find my own subjects there. I should probably take a step back and explain to people that don't know what Lembeh is, uh, because you might have heard the word. And I think it's the Lembeh Strait has become a very famous diving destination. I think there are, close to 20 diving operators there at the moment. Often a couple of liveaboards will be in the strait as well. And it's so hyped up, it can be very easy to think that Lembeh is an amazing diving destination that every scuba diver in the world should see. And it's not. And I think you have to be clear about that. It's a destination that massively appeals to marine life lovers and even more so to underwater photographers. I know many photographers who do all their trips to Lembeh and they're just happy going there and not to going to other places. But you also, anytime you go there and you don't go on a photo workshop and you're sort of in a normal resort with normal guests coming and going, you will meet guests there who don't like it because when they go on a tropical dive trip, they don't expect low visibility. They don't expect uninspiring scenery underwater. They don't expect, junk and garbage on some of the dive sites. Yet, amongst all of that unappetizing stuff, there are these incredible animals. And if you've ever looked through a fish ID book and seen, all these weird creatures that you've never seen while diving in the tropics, the place to tick those off is a place like Lembeh, because the diving there is a type of diving which we call muck diving, which is about exploring not classic coral reef environments, but exploring muddy slopes, sandy slopes, rubbly slopes, patch reefs, and even sort of impacted by man environments, with the intention of finding and seeing amazing marine life. And the reality is, diving in Lembeh is about not the scenery that you see, but what the dive guides can find for you in those environments. And the diving there is very typically with dive guides, and it's a type of diving that I absolutely adore. It's always very photographically productive. As someone who returns to destinations time and again for running workshops, what I love about Lembeh is however many times you go there, there's always a different mix of critters. There's always species that you haven't photographed before. Maybe not, I think once you've been there as much as me, you've seen, all the A-listers really many times. But it's often the sort of B and C-lister critters that are often more attractive because you've maybe never got a good shot of that type of damselfish or that weird type of scorpion fish, or you're looking for behaviors between things. So however many times you go, because there is so much biodiversity, it's very attractive. But I think it's important to state that although it's a very famous dive destination, it's not a destination for everyone. And you certainly meet people there when you go to resorts who have decided, yeah, I don't really enjoy this because it's not for them.
Yeah, it's not. It's definitely not an aesthetically pleasing. I mean, there's some reefs here and there
Mm,
that you get coral heads on, but the if you're there for the weird stuff, you're going to look for trash piles and mud and some seagrass and things like that. Anyone who's been there, I've only been there once, but my favorite dive site was Hairball, which is literally just black sand and like one or two coral heads,
mm,
100 yards apart, and it's just loaded with all sorts of weird, wacky
mm,
crazy stuff, hairy frogfish, painted frogfish, the devil scorpion fish, whatever else is there.
mm.
Alex, I know you and I talked a little bit before you went on this trip about what you're hoping to see, so I have to ask, did you get your rhinopius?
No, so Lembeh was rhinopias free on this trip. I think that was really just a request because I don't always see them that regularly in Lembeh.
Yeah.
I think some of my older trips, they were, back in the 2000s, it seemed like every trip there was always another new rhinopius of another great color every time I seemed to go. And for the last few times I've been, I've not had any rhinopius luck in Lembeh. So I was sort of hoping for that just personally. But we were rewarded with a fantastically rich mixture of creatures. All the sort of normal A-listers were out and about, and we had really nice photography. It's been quite a bad year for weather in Lembeh. About a month and a half ago there, about a month before we went, they had some really, really bad flooding, which has actually caused a lot of landslides in the area. And actually there's big gaps in the forest that covers both the island and the mainland. Just to explain, Lembeh, which I should have said at the beginning, is in Indonesia, in the northern part of Sulawesi, near the well-known city of Manado. But it's across on the other coast, so it's on the east coast of North Sulawesi. And it's a strait of water about 10 miles long that's sandwiched between the mainland of North Sulawesi and the island of Lembeh. And it creates this narrow stretch that's rarely more than a mile wide, and sometimes quite a bit narrower than that, or quite a lot narrower than that. And along the edges of that strait, there is very protected waters, but there's quite strong tidal exchanges. So they create this very rich environment for marine life. The other reason that Lembeh is so good for diving is that it's not one dive site. There's 60, 70 plus dive sites if you really want to list them all. But those dive sites are not the same. You have everything from, completely barren black sand. You have muddy sites. You have, coarser sands. You have sand breaking down into rubble. You have steep slopes, shallow slopes. You have patch reefs with rubble fields below them. And then even within the sites, you can have shallow water reefs, then you can have a fully sandy slope. And then as the slope flattens off at the bottom, you'll often get a rubble bed covered in, even, amazing soft corals growing on these tiny lumps of rock at the bottom of the, rubble at the bottom of the slope. And it's that hodgepodge of microhabitats that actually makes the diving there so rich. It's not about just one type of muck dive. It's actually a whole mixture of different types of muck diving that give you, and each one has very characteristic critters. And, I often, when we stay there, at Lembeh Resort, I often say to the guys, if your boat's, you don't necessarily need to, know the names of all the sites, but if your boat is turning right out to the resort, use this lens. If it's turning left, use that lens, because that will take you into areas of different habitat, and those different habitats maybe favor different types of macro lenses and things like that. So that's a great reason for its attraction. But yeah, that hopefully has given people a bit of an introduction to Lembeh.
I often compare it to, well, it's easy because we have blue heron right here, and I know I talk about blue heron a lot, but I've always said one of the reasons that I suspect blue heron is so diverse for the weird wacky stuff is it's like a miniature Lembeh in one dive site, because you have like 6 or 7 different microhabitats that are all used by different animals. So it all attracts a different range of critters. You have seagrass beds, you have muck, you have sand and rubble, you have the bridge pilings, you have some patch reefs, things like that, even some little wrecks. They all kind of attract their own genres of marine life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's kind of that scaled up.
Well, and you have the thing which a lot of the critters are also drawn to, is you have protection and tidal exchange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so you've got water movement, but not waves. And I think that is something that, a lot of these slower moving creatures like, frogfish and seahorses don't do well if there's strong surge and swell. They'll put up with it occasionally. But, so those protected waters do help pull the animals in. We on this trip, as if you people might be aware is that the whole area is volcanic, and there are active volcanoes everywhere through Indonesia, but particularly in that part, there's one right next to Manado Airport. There's another one, just offshore, which is one of the big one of the islands where you dive around. There's another big volcano as you drive across to Lembeh Strait, which is only about 15 miles away. But while we were there, one of the volcanoes in the area, a little bit further away, further north of offshore and further north of Lembeh, was erupting. It was erupting the week before we went, and about 2 weeks before we went, and for about a week running up to the trip, the airport was closed. Fortunately, it opened for us. It opened about 5 days before our trip, stayed open, and then closed the day after my group got in. Because there was another quite big eruption a day or two after most of the workshop officially started. And then the airport was then closed for a whole week that we were there, reopening, thankfully for us, 3 or 4 days before we left. So our travel wasn't interrupted by it at all. But it did make a big difference there because Lembeh can be very busy with divers. And, one advantage for us of having the volcano erupting is, we had our whole group there, but there was no one else coming in and out to other resorts. And in fact, quite a few of the other resorts were completely empty and weren't run. They didn't have anyone, just because they got caught out unluckily with, they probably had groups coming in on the days when flights were cancelled. And obviously with the erupting volcano, some people were put off going, even though it's a long way away, just for the inconvenience. I don't think anyone was overly concerned that it was a particularly dangerous volcano, but that there was that there could be impact on travel. And when you're sitting at home and everything's nice and calm, signing up to fly all the way around the world to be near an active volcano sometimes puts people off. Hopefully, for all the resorts out there, that's the end of the trouble from this volcano for at the moment, and everyone can get back to being busy again. Because after the floods in Lembeh a month ago, I think that it's been quite a tough time on everyone living in the area. And I know that it will be, great if all the resorts can be full. There's money coming in, dive stars and resort staff have got some money and that sort of thing to help some of the villages that have been struggling with just the damage from the flooding.
So, how was the frogfish life while you were there?
So yeah, very good. So I think so. There were some striated frogfish, but there were no classically hairy frogfish. Sometimes you can have a whole bunch of them. I think they're all in Florida at the moment. So, and it's funny actually because I remember when I started diving, I can't remember who it was, but one of the big photographers had this big article and story and presentation about how the discovery of the hairy frogfish and how the hairy frogfish just blew everyone's mind away, and that you could only find it in this tiny place in Indonesia that you could see that. And he wrote all these articles saying, these are super rare animals. No one's ever going to see them unless they travel to Indonesia. And then suddenly it turns out that actually the USA, where the guy was from, is the best place to see them.
Yeah.
But it's but apart from that, it was really nice. We had really good action with frogfish and octopuses and seahorses, lots of nudibranchs. So kind of, I'm not a rare animal chaser. You know what I mean? I like to spend time with quality photographic subjects. I don't really mind what those subjects are. So having some good frogfish to shoot, having some good octopus to shoot. I feel that underwater photography has become macro photography. I don't like the trend particularly, certainly not for my own work, in the fact that there's so much artificial nature being introduced into macro pictures. I much prefer, I want good photography, but good photography that really speaks to the nature rather than speaks about the photographer who took it. It doesn't mean that as a contest judge, I judge like that. And in UPY, I'm always keen to reward people who are pushing boundaries back, creating new techniques, creating new visuals in underwater photography. But certainly in my own work, I don't really want that stuff permeating everywhere. I mean, I'll always try some new, fancy bits of gear and things and try some of that stuff because it's always important to be playing with those things. But I only really want to use those techniques where they say the things I want about the subject. So like for example, my Trier plan shot from the wildlife photographer, I felt that the the technique there was enhancing the narrative of what I wanted to communicate through the image. Whereas I think a lot of underwater photography in Lembeh and in Bali as well, and in Analau and wherever else, is very much photographers who have nothing to say about the subject, but lots to say about themselves. And that's something I really like, is when you can spend time with creatures, you have the chance to think about what you want to say about that animal and choose the right lens. And one of the things we do a lot during the workshop is we spend the first few days identifying which of the sites that are really rich in subjects. And then we'll repeatedly dive those sites, so that when you go to those sites, you first of all may be able to revisit with a different lens, a different technique, ready to go for a subject you know is going to be there, but also you know that the site's going to be full of subjects, so you're really able to work them hard. And one of the things that I do on the workshops is that we can split the group onto as many boats as we want, but I like to start the workshop with the group concentrated onto 2 boats. And people think, why would you do that when everyone can have their own boat? Isn't that the best? And it isn't for me in Lembeh, because it's the more guides you can put onto a site, the more creatures they will find. And if you know a site has some good subjects on, and you put 4 guides in and 8 photographers in, those 4 guides will find a whole load of other stuff, as well as finding all the regulars. So you really supercharge the photographic opportunities. And then once you've established, oh yeah, we know on that site it's got 2 of these and 4 of those and 6 of those, or whatever, you can then keep sending boats back there, and people know what they're going to see and can get those shots. So,
and that's one thing I'd like to echo what you just said about the dive guides. Is a little shout out to dive guides kind of everywhere. Is if you can get local knowledge, they can be invaluable.
Absolutely.
Lembeh, for example, the one time I went, I stayed at Nad Lembeh. My guy's name was Johan. So if anybody goes there, ask for Johan. He's awesome. The last day of the trip, he's like, "What do you want to see?" And he'd already found me pretty much everything that I had cared to see. And I was like, "All right, find me a hairy frogfish." First dive of the day, finds me a hairy frogfish. And while I'm photographing that, he comes over, writes blue ring octopus on his slate. And I was like, okay, cool. I'll come see that in a little bit. He swims away. I'm still shooting the frogfish, comes back over, orange painted frogfish, writes it on his slate. And by the time I was done with the hairy frogfish, he has a list of like 8 other things for me to go photograph. And that's just, they dive those places every single day. They know how to find that stuff. And that applies to everywhere. So if you're wondering why you're not seeing things, find somebody to who, like, and all those resorts, they have the guides. You're kind of with them no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely.
But even the time I was there, people would go off, and it's one thing if you have a ton of experience like yourself to go try to find your own stuff, but we'd have people coming back being like they didn't see anything, and I'm like, well, stay with the guide and don't go off and do your own thing if you're actually looking for stuff, because they've dived these places thousands and thousands of times. I guarantee you'll have a better time if you actually spend time.
No, absolutely. It's a skill to learn as a photographer. I think muck diving, it's a very easy type of diving, but there are a number of specific skills you need to develop. You need to learn to dive very, very lightly weighted. I always set myself up for diving there. So without a camera, I can't sink. I always dive with a negative camera. And if I don't have the camera, I float away. If I put my camera down on the seabed and let go of it to take a picture, I float. I never put any air in my BC the whole time I'm in Lembeh. I would happily dive in a harness there, because you always got very safe, easy pickups at the end of dives. But so I never ever put. If you're putting air in your BC in Lembeh, you're overweight, and people dive heavy. You should. I definitely float in Lembeh without my camera. So those are skills you have to develop, but you also need to develop that learning to dive with a guide. And I always say to the groups on the workshop, if your dive guide is running around trying to find you, chasing after you, looking after you, that's time they're not finding you great subjects.
Yes.
But I run my workshops there at Lembeh Resort, which is a very, very comfortable, very, very nice, very friendly, excellent place to stay. It's one of the more higher end resorts. It's got fantastic dive guides, as you would expect. Many of them are very well known. And have been, based at that resort for years and years and years. But I would say that at any resort in Lembeh, you will have fantastic dive guides. You don't get employed as a dive guide in Lembeh unless you're really, really good. And Manado is a real centre of diving excellence in Lembeh. If you go on a Raja Ampat liveaboard, you can bet that 3 out of your 4 dive guides will be from Manado. And they'll often be the only people from North Sulawesi on the boat. The rest will be Indonesian, but from other parts of Indonesia. But the guides, time and again, are always coming from Manado area, and the best of those get to stay close to home. I mean, it's not completely true or fair, but they get to stay and dive in Lembeh. So all the resorts have those fantastic dive guides. But yeah, learning to dive with them is a big part of being successful there.
Yeah, and for because they have that search image that people who don't dive there all the time don't necessarily have. And like you can dive. Like I remember when I've dived in Florida, 1,000. I've done 1,000 dives here. I can find anything here, but sometimes it's a little bit different when you go other places, and it takes you some time to get going with being able to find things. Yeah. And it's another time when the dive guides can be invaluable. It's like I think I'm pretty good at finding things here, but if I go there, they're going to be better. They're going to be better than I am in their environment, finding you cool stuff. So don't neglect your dive guides when you go to cool places, because chances are you'll see a lot more if you allow them to do their job.
Yeah, and they've learned to find so much more down the years. Yeah. The first book, or the first big book on Lembeh, was Konstantinos Petrinos' book.
I love it.
Pygmy Seahorse, and it's a great book. But if you actually read it when you're in Lembeh, you look through it and you almost notice how many things that are absolutely classic Lembeh these days aren't in that book, because the guides learned to find them. They found, when that book was done, there was probably only 20 dive sites that were dived in Lembeh. And as they've explored more places, they found, different microhabitats with a whole other mix of creatures. There's, weird, tiny things that they've learned to find. That book was, years before people started shooting, hairy shrimps or Malibu, skeleton Malibu nudibranchs or whatever it is. They're always finding ways to find new creatures there as well. So it's that's why I love going back, and I will continue to dive in Lembeh, I'm sure, for as long as I can, because it's an absolute favorite place.
Well, I can say for myself, I'm looking forward to seeing some pictures from there. Oh, you have a frogfish story to tell us about one particular frogfish.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just going to tell you before we went on air, but I might as well tell you on air, and I can drop the video in as well. In that, I was photographing this large female painted frogfish, and every time I went to photograph her, she was always running. And one time I went up to her, she was up the slope, and I was shooting with the MWL, so I went down next to her to photograph her, and up the slope, and she started coming down towards me. So I'm backing up, and because I'm backing up, I'm basically backing up into my own silt. So I was getting these beautiful clean shots. It was a murky dive site, and it was very silty because of all the runoff from the flooding. And as I backed up, I was creating silt, so I was getting very annoyed because I couldn't shoot anymore, because I was like, I'm just going to get backscatter, so I might as well wait. And then, so she was running down the slope towards me. She was going so fast that she actually tripped herself up, and I was backing up, and she goes head over heels in front of me. And I've got the photos of her going over and, like the complete, tumble, because she was trying to go so fast. And then I started, pulling off the sand, because I was like, oh, I'm just stirring up sediment here. So I started swimming up into mid-water. She chased me up into mid-water, gulping, and I've got the video of her swimming along, gulping air, squirting it out through her jets, and basically chasing me in mid-water. And yeah, she was always on the move. Really funny frogfish to spend time with. So active and animated, you couldn't sneak up on her and take pictures of her. She was just off. So there's a video of my EMWL sticking out with the strobes in the picture, and then just her swimming at the EMWL. I've obviously got photos. I have to show, and I probably should need to show the full video, so that when people see my mid-water frogfish shots, they know it's a crazy frogfish and not a crazy photographer behaving badly.
I'm sure you'll be able to drop that in here, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. So I'll have to rewatch our episode.
Bad luck.
But thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in the next one.